You are watching The Nation. Good to have you with us tonight. We're going to return to the politics of the week, and it has been a difficult week for the government, arguably one of their worst since taking office. You had the ABC cuts, whatever the merits of those, a broken promise that it took, well, some while to acknowledge that the Prime Minister had even said there would be no cuts to the ABC prior to the election. Then you had the Defence Minister, David Johnson, putting his foot in it over the Australian Submarine Corporation. And the week closing out with a lot of confusion over the GP co-payment, one of the central policies of the budget. And the government today saying that it will still put this to Parliament, despite a lot of reporting and presumably background briefing that they were going to quietly ditch the whole thing. Joining us tonight to discuss all that's been going on, Darren Chester, the Parliamentary Secretary to the Defence Minister. David Miles is a former Liberal advisor, now with Willard Public Affairs. John Whelan is a former Labor advisor for a number of Labor leaders, in fact, Kim Beazley, Kevin Rudd and Julia Gillard.
Indeed. Thank you, David.
And Michelle Rowland, Shadow Minister for Citizenship and Multiculturalism, Shadow Assistant Minister for Communications. Welcome to you all.
Yes, David.
The Prime Minister said in the party room meeting this week, the joint party room meeting, that there were one or two barnacles that he wants cleared from the government's ship by the end of the year. Darren Chester, do you think there are some barnacles, and what do you think they are?
Well, I wouldn't describe them as barnacles as you... were you in the party meeting, were you?
Well, we were given the official briefing.
Oh, OK. No, look,
You're suggesting he didn't say that?
No, I'm not saying anything of the sort. I don't normally comment on party room meetings of any form. It's a bit of a culture in the National Party not to leak, unlike some of the other parties. But my view of it is that the government has had a very good year. You've had your 12 months in. You've been in a position where we've repealed the carbon tax, the mining tax, got the 3 free trade agreements in, which the Labor Party said we'd never do. And then there's some other policy areas which have obviously been the subject of a great deal of discussion since the budget, which are proving more troublesome in the sense that we haven't been able to get a consensus in any way, shape or form through the Senate, and the Senate is a difficult beast for the government at the moment. Anyone who's fair in their interpretation would say it's a bit hard to negotiate with people who have quite vastly different
opinions. They also
opinions.
seem to be pretty unpopular policies in the electorate, don't they?
Which ones?
GP co-payment, higher education reform,
the GP,
petrol tax.
The GP co-payment is one that's created a bit of traffic in my electorate. I'd happily acknowledge that, and as you would as a local member, you forward those concerns onto the Health Minister, and they're heard. So
are these issues you want cleared by the end of the year, whether you call them a barnacle or whatever?
Yeah, look, I think the government has every right to try and get through some of those more troublesome policy areas and say we want to start 2015 with a bit more clear air.
So how do you do that on the GP co-payment?
But as I was saying, you can't then not acknowledge some of the great achievements in those 12 months as well. I'd say the government's had a pretty good year, but there's no doubt there's some other policy areas which are causing us a bit of grief.
So how do you get clear air on the GP co-payment?
Well, part of it is negotiations, engagements, discussion, making sure you continue those. But
after 8 months, do you have to draw a line under it, or will you just keep on negotiating indefinitely?
Well, politics is the art of the possible, and what's realistic is can you negotiate an outcome with this Senate? What the Australian people probably don't always recognise is that over the last 60 years, there's only been about 16 or 15 years where the government of the day has had control of both houses. So it's not unusual for a government to have to negotiate with the Senate to try and get legislation through.
Clearly that's been going on for whatever it is, 8, 9 months, and you still haven't even put it to Parliament. You haven't put it to a vote at all. So do you take the end of the year as a marker at which, OK, we're going to have to either shelve it, ditch it, or put it to a vote, or something?
Well, look, in some ways, I'm the kind of personality who believes deadlines make things happen. So perhaps you do set yourself a deadline, whether you set it publicly or you set it within the in the cabinet room. I'm not sure whether that discussion's been had. Maybe you do set a deadline and say, if we can't get it done by this time, we may have to then say, well, how else are we going to make Medicare sustainable? Because if we keep going down the path we're going down, Medicare won't be sustainable.
So at the end of next week, when Parliament rises for the year, if you haven't got it through, you've got to look at another way of...
Oh, well, but no, it's not due to start to July 1, 2015 under the proposal put forward to the budget. So
you've got a bit more time.
Well, Cabinet's got time to discuss it, but I do believe that perhaps we need to set a timeline for if we can't get it through, how are we going to make sure that we can afford Medicare in 10 years' time? The essence of the issue is Medicare is costing us more into the future than it's sustainable right now. And so if you stand in the road and block that, then you have to say to the Labor Party, well, what will you support? What will you support to make sure Medicare is sustainable?
Rowland, let me bring you in here, because the figures are quite alarming, aren't they? 10 years ago, Medicare was costing the taxpayer $8 billion. Today it's costing $20 billion, and in 10 years it's going to apparently cost $34 billion. The Medicare levy only covers half of that $20 billion that we're currently paying. So it's going to become an increasingly heavy burden on the taxpayer's shoulder unless it is made more sustainable.
The reality is, David, look, we are living longer in Australia and we all want to live better. And with that comes intense challenges for governments of any persuasion. The issue is how you respond to those challenges. The reason why this is bad policy in response to the issue of making Medicare more sustainable is that in fact it won't in the long term. We've already seen people who have chronic health conditions already stop going to their GP because they thought that the co-payment was already in place. And these are people who need ongoing attention and need to keep seeing their GP.
So how do you tackle this problem about the ballooning cost of Medicare?
I think it can be tackled in a couple of ways. Firstly, of course, governments need to make savings. Governments need to be responsible savers, but also this is an issue...
You've opposed pretty much everything they've tried.
Well, I oppose this because it's bad policy for a start. But in terms of what Labor will be doing, look, I'm very upfront in saying, look, we are going through a policy formulation process at the moment. Bill Shorten was very clear in his National Press Club address that he wants next year to be the year when we actually formulate these policies and take them early to the Australian people.
I get that, but on this issue in particular, just sticking to the health budget, it's ballooning. The forecasts are clear. There's got to be a way of making it more sustainable, hasn't there?
Absolutely, and that's why, as I mentioned, Labor in government made responsible savings, but Labor seeking to be re-elected will also formulate policies which respond to that challenge in a way that is fair, in a way that doesn't result in
Is there a way to make this more fair than what the government's proposed, perhaps? I mean, why shouldn't you or I pay a $7 fee to go to see the GP?
I'm not prepared to see Medicare erode in the nature of its universality. I'm not prepared to see that.
But is that really eroding Medicare and its universality? I mean, a lot of us pay to go to the doctor already.
It certainly is, but when you have bulk billing rates in some parts of Australia, including my electorate, which is in the top 10 of the bulk billing areas of Australia, when you have areas like that that would have this co-payment enforced upon them, then you have clear inequities in the system. I'm not prepared to see Medicare be eroded for the sake of introducing such a bad policy.
John Whelan, let me bring you in. In your years as a policy advisor, you no doubt would have grappled with the health budget and what to do about it. It's not a new problem, is it? What do you think of this policy response? Is there a middle ground here where you can have some fairness or more fairness around a $7 payment?
David, the GP co-payment is narrow and it's punitive and it doesn't give the government the sorts of savings that it actually needs. So from a policy perspective, it's actually a false positive. And of course, politically, they're wearing a lot of heat as well. It's hard to see the policy benefits in price signalling people away from an early diagnosis and in price signalling people into their emergency department. So ultimately, this could actually increase stress on our emergency departments. And because people aren't getting that early diagnosis, we actually run the risk of people having more and more interactions with the health department. So in pure policy terms, David, it's an absolute false positive and it's also incredibly punitive. And that's why it's a bad idea and the government needs to reconsider it.
David Miles, do you accept, and this gets to the whole reason for a co-payment to stop people frivolously going to the doctor, that it might have the opposite effect of sending them to the hospital, meaning they don't get the early diagnosis that makes it cheaper to fix the problem they've got, that it might actually put a heavier strain on the budget?
Well, I'm not convinced of that argument. I mean, there were more than 200 million doctor visits in the last year. There's more than 10 for every man, woman and child in this country. I'm not convinced that it's necessary for every man, woman and child to go to the GP 10 times or more a year. It just,
but it might be necessary for some of us to go.
Necessary.
It might be necessary for some of us to go every couple of weeks if you've got a health problem that requires.
For some that would be the case, and there's a cap on this as well. But there's a cap on this of $70 a year. So once you've had 10 visits, you don't pay any more anyway. So, plus there is part of the reason of the doctors getting $5 and the $5, $2 split was so that they would have a fund available to ensure that those that needed it most didn't have to pay either. There's got to be a price point that comes in somewhere. There is a copay. There's a copay on pharmaceuticals, which is a natural extension of you can't get a pharmaceutical without going to the doctor. Why is that okay?
The Prime Minister makes this point as well. Why is it different to have? It's okay in Labor's view to have a price signal on the medicine, but not on visiting the doctor?
Well, the reality is we already pay for Medicare through a Medicare levy. The whole issue of stating
that doesn't cover
we
all
should
of
go,
Medicare.
the whole issue, but the whole premise of saying that you should pay each time, not only going to a GP, but for some sort of diagnosis, every time you have a blood test, every time you have some other sort of scan or so forth, the idea of having to pay that each time, and the notion, I remember sitting here and Steve Chobo was sitting where you're sitting, Darren, when it was just announced, basically telling me we're a nation of hypochondriacs. Well, in the long term, you only get to efficiencies in the health system if you have early diagnosis, if you have prevention, and if you keep people out of emergency departments. And that is exactly the opposite of what this co-payment is going to do.
I perhaps should have said at the outset of this that Darren Chester's obviously taking part in November, in case anyone was in any doubt.
It did come to my mind a moment ago as well.
It just popped in my head. I see you most days, so I just thought I'd remind that. Anyway,
3 days. 3 days.
3 days to go.
3 days to go.
And then the razor comes out.
Yes.
Okay,
Keep
good.
it, mate. Keep it.
I'm interested in exploring whether there is middle ground here. Could you have a situation where you get a certain number of free visits to the doctor and then the charge kicks in? Maybe you get 5 visits a year that you don't pay for, and then you start paying a fee.
Well, that's a reasonable position you're putting, but from what I've seen from the Labor Party, it's refusing to negotiate on the issue at all. They're just folding their arms and saying, no, you're not going to have it, and not going to be part of the solution. Now, I acknowledge that Michelle believes there are opportunities and there is a need to make sure the health system is more sustainable in the future. This is our idea. This is a policy we've put forward. If the Labor Party is going to fold its arms and say no, what's Labor's idea?
Well, I think we've just heard that they're in a policy formulation period.
We certainly are, but look, David, the other thing is, last night we had journalists backgrounded that the GP co-payment was off, and I had to do stop press on my Christmas newsletter. And then we wake up the next day and we have everyone from Peter Dutton saying we might do it by regulation, Eric Abetz saying it's still policy, Ian McDonald saying he's not going to vote for it. This is chaos.
David Moss, to that point, it is a bit chaotic politically, isn't it? It seems the government's half pregnant on this. You've had this policy since May, centrepiece of the budget. It hasn't even been put into Parliament, and we're not sure whether it will be.
Well, look, I think, there's been a lot of words used. I think they're all basically saying the same thing.
Which is what?
Well, which is it remains policy, but it can't get through the Senate. So it's a pretty simple proposition. There's no point putting a bill into the Senate if you can't get the votes. And until you've got to that position...
What's wrong with putting something for a vote and losing?
But because it's pointless. It wastes time of the Senate when you've got other things you're trying to do.
It shows you're serious about it, though.
Serious about it? Just putting in a bill and wasting everybody's time. You know whether you've got the numbers through the negotiations you have. There's no point putting a bill up until you know that you've got votes for it. And it's just the simple mathematics of Parliament.
We tried, we gave people an opportunity to vote for and against it. That mob voted against it, and we believe in it, and we put it up for a vote. Are you saying the best option is simply to keep it as policy?
Well, you may well find it another way. I mean, it may take longer. It may well appear in next year's budget. Well, whether it's done through regulation, whether it's done in a mechanism that you perhaps talked about, there's a lot of creative ways that you could do things in order to get a price point on it. Maybe you have an offset against the PBS co-pay. One goes up and one goes down as a blend of the two. I don't know. There's lots of
ideas here.
There's lots of policy options that you could do.
Yeah.
It's to me, it's always been one of those difficulties of increasing the co-payment on pharmaceuticals while decreasing and having a zero co-pay for doctors, because one goes with the other.
Well, it just seems to me when you look at those figures, John Whelan, we are going to see an increasing strain on the health budget. You've got to pay for it somehow. If you don't do it this way, do you just keep having to jack up the Medicare levy?
Look, I think all options should be on the table, but the thinking needs to be bigger, because the sorts of savings that we're talking about making here will not make the system sustainable. The demographic shift is huge, as we all know. So the thinking needs to be akin to the sort of thinking that we had when we started superannuation under a Labor government. Those sorts of options, however, aren't really on the table.
By which you mean putting in more than just whatever it is, 1.5% at the moment?
Indeed. We need to think more seriously about how we're going to make the system more sustainable, not come at it in these boutique and narrow ways. The other point I'd make about the last week, David, is that it strikes me that this is the first time that I can recall that the Liberal government has had an internal battle being fought publicly through the newspaper.
On this issue, you mean?
Indeed, indeed. And today...
You think this is an internal battle between those who want to stay with the policy purity that was announced in May and those who want to make a political expedient decision and get rid of it as a problem.
Well, David, it seems that
Or are you just talking about Ian McDonald?
No, it seems that the Prime Minister's office has got a view based on what we were hearing this morning, and then there was an attempt to recover the policy by Mr Dutton and Mr Hockey and others throughout the course of the day. I think this is playing out publicly, and that is a bad look for this government.
I think you're reading too much into that.
You've obviously worked in a few Labor leaders' offices, and you've seen a lot more of this than I've ever seen in my lifetime. I've never seen a more united cabinet than the one you're seeing over the last 12 months, and I think you're reading way too much into a public policy which is difficult, and the government acknowledges it's difficult, and trying to get a hodgepodge of senators to agree on anything is always going to be hard, particularly if it's quite contentious. And so it's playing out quite awkwardly in a public space. But
Darren,
I think you're going another step to try and
playing out quite awkwardly. What do you put that down to?
Well,
I mean, journalists, you know journalists, they're not making this up.
No, I would never accuse you of that, David. No, it's obvious there's been a fair bit of discussion both in front of cameras and behind cameras about what the government's trying to achieve. And I accept it's a difficult policy position to try and convince the senators to support, and that hasn't made for a very tidy week on this particular policy issue. But across the board, the government has been rock solid over these 12 months in terms of those really significant policy achievements, and I think it deserves some credit for that.
Just on some other...
I'm not expecting to get any, but I think it does deserve some credit for that.
Well, no, I do give the government credit for a number of the things that you listed earlier, but on other potential barnacles, David Miles, what do you think the PM might have in mind that he wants to clear away by the end of the year?
I don't know, you'd have to ask him. Look, there's obviously a lot of things that they're trying to get through the Senate. There's savings that they can't get through. And, there are challenges. I mean, obviously the issue, with the ABC is a barnacle in one sense, and people are talking about it a lot. I mean, you'd think it was a Labor leadership battle, the amount they talk about themselves. An enormous amount of coverage given to a pretty small cut to an institution that's got so
more to
much
do
money.
with the broken promise. We'll talk about that later.
Well, we can talk about that later, and that's fine.
But in terms of the government's problems, are there other budget measures you think that need to be cleared up apart from this one?
I think part of the problem for any government, and this government, they're obviously the ones that are in power, is that revenue is dropping, particularly as a result of lower iron ore revenue, and they're not able to get saving measures through that they promised to do.
So the $5.5 billion paid parental leave scheme, do you think this would be a good reason, justification to say, look, we just can't do it at the moment?
It may well be something that gets delayed. I mean, I'm a big supporter of the PPL. I think it's an excellent policy and I'd like to see it in. But the reality is that you can't do things for which you haven't got the money. And that goes to whether it is salary increases for public servants or for defence, or whether it is medical research funds, if you can't get the measures through that are going to fund it. Whatever it might be, you've got to, the Liberal Party or the Liberal National Government has to stick to its narrative that our job is to fix the mess that Labor left us. And if they can't do it in the ways that they've tried to do, they're going to have to think of some new things. Because you can't just leave the deficit continuing to rise.
I know we've spoken about paid parental leave probably a few times, but is this a good point at which to send it on its way? Scrub that barnacle off?
Well, the difficult thing, you're talking about promises and whether things have been broken or not. The paid parental leave scheme was a promise that the Prime Minister made as a signature policy. He took to the Australian people twice. In 2010 he wasn't successful by a narrow margin, and obviously successful last year. So he clearly can argue the case. He's got a mandate to introduce a policy that he took to the Australian people on 2 occasions. There was no secret about that policy. It's been one that's been out there for a very long time. So it's very, very clever of our opponents and journalists to attack us if we're seen to break what they regard as a promise or a commitment, but then call on us to break the ones they find quite convenient. So you can't have it both ways.
No, now I'm sure both of you have a long list of barnacles you reckon the government should get rid of. But John, in terms of political reality here, what do you reckon the PM can do between now and the end of the year?
Well, David, I think there's barnacles, then there's the quality of the crew, then there's the direction in which the ship is going.
You've been saving that up all day.
And I've given it some thought, Darren, and I think they're in trouble on all three fronts at the moment. And Barnacle of the Week must go to the Minister for Defence. Talking down an Australian company in that way was just extraordinary. So to continue the metaphor, I suspect he may well be walking the plank at some point in a reshuffle. I suspect the Prime Minister will reshuffle. I think he probably needs to. I think he needs to get some more women into the Cabinet as well. In terms of the barnacles that need to be removed, the GP co-payment needs to go. The paid parental leave scheme, I actually think the funding source is right, but the distribution's wrong. And they should certainly have a look at that. I'm probably at odds with many people in the Labor Party on that front, because I think the company tax contribution to that is worthwhile.
I think you could better tailor that, though, with the childcare issue. And there's a Productivity Commission report on childcare sitting in the in-tray. The government hasn't released it yet. But you could probably rework it into something that targets not just paid parental leave, but childcare as well.
You could probably look at that, David, indeed. But also, in terms of the direction that the government is heading, I think there's a real sense that Australia is becoming less fair. And I think Bill Shorten's onto it. And his speech at the Press Club yesterday was compelling.
All right.
Yeah.
We're going to take a quick break. I'll give you points for the best line of the night so far. We might talk a bit more about whether there would be any merit in changing the front bench lineup. And we're going to talk about broken promises as well. Stay with us.
It's cold now and your free Mastercard time.
Just in time for Christmas, get 0% interest on purchases for 6 months if you apply and are approved by December 31st. Apply today.
Coles Mastercard.
The get-together. It comes in many different forms. The wedding. The farewell. The catch-up. The knock-off. The celebration. The girls' night out. The Sunday lunch. And the reunion. It's magic bringing people together. Your local club.
Once upon a time, you needed petrol power. Petrol power is so yesterday. Ryobi's 36-volt cordless range. Today's power in the garden.
Trade in and trade up now to a Massport and we'll give you a minimum of $50 trade-in on your old mower. So look for your participating Massport dealer and view the great Massport range at massport.com.au.
That's not just a mower, son. It's a Massport.
No one likes being left behind. But that's what will happen to Australia if we don't have a sustainable future for our universities and our students. With changes to make it fair, the proposed university legislation can deliver this future. We call on the Senate to amend and pass a fair compromise to keep it clever. Authorised by B. Robinson, Universities Australia, Canberra.
John mentioned before the break the Defence Minister's comment a couple of nights ago, that ASC, our submarine, our shipbuilders, owned by the government, he wouldn't trust to build a canoe. Darren Chester, you're the Parliamentary Secretary to the Defence Minister. What would you trust the ASC with?
Well, to begin with, I'd trust the Minister for Defence. I think he's doing a terrific job. Did he regret making that comment in the way he did with that rhetorical flourish? Yes, he did, and he explained that the next day.
Is it more than that, though? I mean, does it reveal the government clearly doesn't have a lot of faith in this outfit?
Well, there's a couple of issues here. I mean, this contract or this project is about $350 to $600 million. Somewhere in that ballpark, the Air Warfare Destroyer, over budget and behind time. So there's significant issues there. Now that is a legacy issue.
And that's the frustration.
Well, that's a legacy issue inherited from the previous government. I'm not going to blame the government purely for that. It's a legacy issue. It's one you've got to tidy up. And Defence has, when things go wrong in Defence, they go wrong in a way which costs you millions, if not billions of dollars. So the Minister was clearly frustrated. He expressed that in the Senate in a way which you probably would have preferred him to only use that expression if he was around a bar with a couple of mates talking about an issue. He he used quite colourful description for it. And
in other words, he means it. He just shouldn't have said it.
No, I'm not trying to be smart. I'm just saying that he used a colourful phrase. Australians are known for colourful phrases. And if we're going to crack down hard on a bloke who makes a statement that is a little bit extravagant, then journos are going to have some pretty boring interviews with a lot of members of Parliament. He used it was a flourish, a rhetorical
I've got no
flourish.
problem with flourish and rhetoric.
Yeah.
I think that's great, more of it. But if the sentiment is, from the minister no less, that the company that's building our ships and maintaining our subs and essentially, keeping our nation defended, can't.
We've got to, I think you've got to become a bit fairer to the minister in the sense that he has worked very hard to try and get this company into a position where it is in a strong position to build the future frigate program. He is trying to get this process back on track so we can have some faith, some confidence into the future that they can get on top of this big job.
And does this sort of language help? I mean, does that put a lot of confidence and faith behind the company?
The minister apologised for it.
No, I appreciate that, but if his view is clearly that the joint's no good, does that really achieve that aim?
I'm not sure what you're indicating now. He was exasperated on that occasion in the Senate and expressed his frustration in a quite colourful way. But he's working extraordinarily hard to ensure that those positions are available in Adelaide into the future under the Future Frigate program. But you've got to acknowledge this project has fallen way behind. It's at least $350 million over budget, if not up to $600 million. It's a problem, and the minister is trying to work to fix it up.
David, what did you make of this? And do you think David Johnston will survive as Defence Minister?
Oh, I've learned a long time ago not to speculate on what's going to happen with reshuffles and otherwise. But look, I think it was an unfortunate term of phrase to use, but it was clearly an expression of frustration. I don't think I didn't interpret it as he was saying they can't build anything or they don't know what they're doing. It was a frustrated expression because he's sick and tired of having to fix up problems where things are over budget. I can understand why you get frustrated with that. We've all used colourful phrases to describe something, that hasn't worked, but it doesn't mean that you don't necessarily mean the specifics of it. So I don't think he has a lack of faith in ASC to build ships and maintain subs. He just expressed frustration with the fact that there'd been blowouts of cost. Yeah, move on.
Michelle Rowland, do you accept that the minister doesn't have any sort of lack of faith? It was just a colourful phrase?
Well, we heard the word frustration used a lot there. That's fine, but this guy's a member of the cabinet, and we all get frustrated in our jobs, but we show discipline and we act up to the position that we're in. This guy's a member of the cabinet. And let's remember too, this isn't the first bit of rhetorical flourish he's had. Remember, he said he didn't attend a national security meeting because he didn't have anything to add. Well, that doesn't exactly instill a lot of confidence. So, to go back to the nautical metaphor, I definitely think there are some issues with the crew on this occasion. And look, I just consider his position to be untenable, quite frankly. And I know, look, and I won't bait or say anything derogatory about him, Darren. I look forward to Darren's promotion. But aside from that, look, I just think any objective measure. This guy's liability.
Michelle, look, I admire your confidence image, but just because I've got the moustache, I'm not going to start singing in the Navy or anything like
Please
that.
Please do.
Maybe after the programme.
But look, the Minister for Defence is in a very different position to the last three Labor ministers because he wants the job. I mean, the last three Labor ministers, one was sacked, one resigned, and one went on strike. Stephen Smith was a pathetic Minister for Defence, just asked people in the ADF. He was missing in action for the whole time he had the portfolio. David Johnston has the respect of the ADF, he has the respect of the department, he has the respect of the cabinet, and he'll be in that role for as long as he wants to be in that role.
Gee, I'll jump to Stephen Smith's defence. I mean, I don't think Stephen Smith would ever have described a domestic supplier, employing thousands of Australians as lacking the capability to construct a canoe.
But he did take quite a lot of money out of defence.
Look, there were certainly budget cuts in defence material. There's no question about it. And contract management of defence projects, as Darren alluded to, is very important because when these contract timeframes extend, they cost a lot of money. But the point about building submarines, and it's not just the fact of the minister's intervention, but its nature that was so damaging. Building submarines is incredibly complicated, and the people that build them tell you that it's akin to building a space shuttle or a lunar landing module. So to say that they lack the capability, our own people, to build a canoe, is really a terrible thing to say, and he should be held to account for it.
But the issue,
and he has been. He's expressed regret and he's apologised. Let's move on.
But he's apologised for meaning it, as David just referred to.
You have now touched on the important issue, and the important issue is just how complex the task is.
Really complex.
And so, I accept if we focus on that issue of how difficult it is, not only but the AWD itself is a difficult ship to construct. I've walked the decks when they've been building them. These are extraordinarily complex endeavours, and the submarines are another quantum ahead of that. So you're right, that is a very complex policy area, capability issue for the government to deal with, and I believe that David Johnson is the man to deal with it.
All right. I want to touch on the ABC as well, because that did dominate a lot of the week. Well, firstly, with the actual cut itself, $254 million from a $5.5 billion spend over 5 years. John, it doesn't sound in those terms like a lot of money. Should the ABC be exempt from cuts that are happening elsewhere?
Look, the answer to that is no. I mean, there is an efficiency dividend and it gets applied. But 400 people out of 4,000 is a lot of staff. But
that's a Mark Scott decision. That's not a Malcolm Turnbull decision. That's up to management of the ABC to do that.
But David, in fairness, I do find that position extraordinary as well, because the government has cut off Mark Scott's arm and are criticising the way he's applying the bandage. I mean, it's pretty ruthless.
Oh, come on.
The cut is significant.
The cut is not significant, and they're not even trying.
10% and 400
to look at ways
staff.
they can save money.
If the cut's not that significant, perhaps Christopher Pyne would have a different view and wouldn't be providing petitions to the Parliament in relation to it. The cuts are significant. I think it's rich to have a cut of this size.
Well, and then, SPS has managed to take their cut without sacking anyone.
And then start attacking the CEO. I think that is pretty ruthless and pretty ordinary.
Oh, that's bollocks. SPS has not made a single person redundant. They've been preparing for this for some time. They've been making efficiencies, and they are not making a single person redundant. Not one. Mark Scott, on the other hand, doesn't look at other ways of saving money, apparently. It's all just done through personnel. And he's been playing this game for some time and talking about content and Peppa Pig and all the other ridiculousness in order to inflict political damage.
Michelle, we did see Bill Shorten say during the week that, or indicate during the week, that Labor would also make some scale of cut to the ABC. Is that right?
Well, what we've made very clear is that the public broadcasters will always be in better hands under Labor.
Okay,
That's what we've made clear.
But you'd still cut their current funding.
Look, we didn't say we'd cut their current funding. We would always want the ABC to have more money under a Labor government. And you only have to look at history to see that the ABC has always been better funded as a public broadcaster under Labor.
Why do you want it to have more money?
But I do want to... Well, I believe in public broadcasting, even if others may not.
But do you think Mark Scott has gone about implementing that cut in the right way?
The thing is, David, there are consequences when you make this level of cuts. You can't cut $250 million out of any organisation and then not expect there to be damage. There are consequences.
Depends on the size of the organisation.
There are consequences.
If you're a $5.5 billion...
But the point is, David, that even Darren has had words to say about cuts that are impacting
in his own area. The way Mark Scott's done the cuts is that they are going to affect things like these regional radio stations, the Bush Telegraph, state line programs. I mean, do you think he's gone about it the right way?
Malcolm Turnbull, look, I know Malcolm Turnbull's trying to make this argument too, and that's filtering down into his caucus. You can't have it both ways. You can't stand up and say, oh, these are decisions of management, we simply supply the funding model and there's a separation of management, and then on the other hand, criticise him for doing his job. He has always said, look at every Senate estimates hearing, what happens depends on the funding envelope. What happens will depend on the level of funding.
Surely we're allowed,
and there are consequences.
Surely anyone's allowed to criticise, though, the way a public organisation is run.
Oh, you can go ahead, and you can go for your life, and you can say, there were efficiencies to be made. There are efficiencies to be made, but the Lewis review that this was based on hasn't even been made public.
No, it hasn't, and apparently because of commercial sensitivity. Let me just finally ask you, as we are nearly out of time, is this, at the end of the day, a broken promise?
Well, no, I'll just quickly touch on the point. Bill Shorten did say on ABC Radio statewide in Victoria this week that he would make cuts. He said he wouldn't be to the same extent. He acknowledged he would have to make some cuts, so we have to accept that. I think the problem for the ABC is it's not my ABC in regional Victoria anymore. It's become the inner city ABC, and unfortunately, as soon as any efficiency dividend or cuts, as you'd like to say, were applied, they went straight to the regions to cut the funding. Now, I think you can have a comment on that, and I'm disappointed. I'm a big fan of the ABC. I rely on heavily in my community for emergency services, for radio news and current affairs, but I'm afraid it's become too much of an inner-city elite station, and I think they've let themselves down. They've become bloated. They're a bureaucracy. They have to start delivering for all Australians, not just the inner-city elite. I'm disappointed with the way the ABC has gone about making these changes.
Look, unfortunately, we are out of time. The discussion cut short a little bit tonight because of obvious reasons, but thank you all very much for joining us tonight for that discussion, the time that we did. Thanks for your company as well, and we will be back same time next week. See you then.